I'm Lorien Foote, the Patricia and Bookman Peters Professor in History at Texas A&M University, and today I'm going to tell you a little-known story from the American Civil War. In February of 1865, towards the end of the war, the Confederate States of America committed an act that violated the principles upon which they had promised to fight their war for independence. They delivered 14 black Union soldiers for exchange as prisoners of war, which indicated that they recognized those soldiers as legitimate combatants, something they had said that they would not do. This moment was critical, and the reason that it occurred was because of the actions of 3 black Union sailors. They forced the Confederate government to this moment, and this is the story of how it happened. The story of this critical policy change for the Confederate government begins in the Department of the South. So this was a military department for the United States Army that was comprised of South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. And at the beginning of the war, its commander was Major General David Hunter. And he was an unusual general in the Union Army. He was an abolitionist, and he had a strategic vision for how to win victory in his department. He wanted to raid plantations, he wanted to raid the coast of South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida, and he wanted to liberate African Americans. And then he wanted to arm the black men that he had liberated, put them in Union uniform, and then continue to conduct raids. It would be a process of liberation. It would be a process of arming black men to fight for their freedom. He believed that those formerly enslaved men were the source of victory for the Union Army, and that by destroying slavery and by creating more manpower for the United States, this was the key to victory. So he began to arm black men who lived on the Sea Islands of South Carolina and Georgia. So this is a map that shows kind of the coastline from Charleston to Savannah. The Union had naval superiority in the beginning of the war, so the Union Navy had captured a series of islands with more than 10,000 enslaved people living on these islands. And the Union Army landed on these islands, and Hunter was able to begin his strategy. And in late 1862, in fact, there was a company of black soldiers who fought off a raid by Confederate soldiers on their island very early there in the war. So when Confederate General Robert E. Lee heard about Hunter's regiment, he wrote a letter addressed to the commanding general of the United States Army in Washington, D.C. And he accused the United States of fighting a savage war because he says, "You have launched servile insurrection." That was actually a legal term that meant an uprising of enslaved people. So to retaliate against the United States for forming a regiment comprised of black soldiers who were former slaves, the Confederate War Department passed General Orders number 60. This is in August of 1862. And in this general order, they outlawed Major General David Hunter. And what that means is he had no legal rights anywhere in the Confederacy. He could be killed by anyone with impunity, with no prosecution. Then the second part of the order said that any captured United States officer who drilled, organized, or instructed slaves with a view to their armed service in the war was not recognized as a prisoner of war, but would be executed as a felon. Well, the Confederate government demanded that the United States quit arming formerly enslaved people in the Department of the South. Now, Hunter's regiment was actually not legally recognized by President Abraham Lincoln and his administration. But by that point in the war, Republicans in Congress, as well as President Lincoln, had committed to a policy of moving towards emancipation. So what's going to happen is Lincoln will give Hunter permission to continue this process of arming black men in putting them in United States uniform. So the first officially recognized regiment in the Department of the South was the 1st South Carolina Volunteers, which was officially mustered into the United States Army in November of 1862. And one of the things that's interesting about this regiment, here's a picture of one of the first sergeants in the regiment. Many of the men who joined the regiment had been, before they joined the Union Army, forming their own military companies to defend themselves against Confederate slaveholders who would make raids onto the islands from the mainland. So these men already had military experience fighting Confederate soldiers even before they officially mustered into the Union Army. What will happen then is Hunter will deploy companies of the 1st South Carolina in a series of 13 landings and actions in November and December of 1862 along the coast of Georgia. They will land on the mainland, they will burn plantations, they will liberate enslaved people, and they will fight off attacks by Confederate soldiers. Here's a map of the Georgia Sea Islands. So you can see the coast of Georgia there and how many little islands dot the coast. And so you can picture these companies of black soldiers fighting for freedom, landing on these islands and liberating enslaved people. Well, the Confederate government is furious about these actions. They do not view these soldiers as legitimate combatants. They view them as slaves in insurrection. So what will happen is the Confederate Congress in May of 1863 passes a resolution. This resolution says that a Confederate military court will try United States commissioned officers in command of black troops for inciting servile surrection and put them to death or otherwise punish them. Then the second part of this resolution, and you've got to look at the wording to this very carefully. The second part says that black soldiers taken in arms, even if born free in a northern state, would be delivered to state authorities in the state where they were captured. So the Confederate resolutions do not make a distinction between formerly enslaved men and black men who were born free in northern states. If they are captured in United States uniform, they will be turned over for trial and potential execution. Only the color of the person's skin is what mattered to the Confederates when they looked at a captured soldier. Well, this is not going to deter David Hunter and other generals in the Department of the South. In fact, they will escalate the number of raids on the mainland. In the summer of 1863, black troops in the Department of the South commit several raids on the South Carolina mainland. One of them is led by the 2nd South Carolina under the command of a colonel named James Montgomery. The 2nd South Carolina is going to sail up the Combahee River. So if you look at this map, you will be able to see kind of coming up from these islands a river called the Combahee River. The 2nd South Carolina is going to steam up the Combahee River on some gunboats. The expedition will be led by Harriet Tubman, who was officially employed as a scout and a spy for General Hunter. And she had scouted out where plantations were, what were the best routes to go. And so she accompanied this expedition. The 2nd South Carolina went up the river, they landed at different plantations, they burned them down, they flooded the rice fields, and they liberated more than 725 people. Well, there were no prisoners captured from the 2nd South Carolina during this raid, so the Confederate government didn't have any prisoners to implement their resolutions against. But this will change just about a month later. The 54th Massachusetts, a northern recruited black regiment commanded by Colonel Robert Gould Shaw, will arrive in the Department of the South. The 54th Massachusetts had some men who were former slaves, but most of the men in the regiment had been born free in northern states. They were farmers, laborers, businessmen from Massachusetts, New York, Ohio, and Michigan. And immediately, the 54th Massachusetts will be put into action. Now, by this time, there was a new commander in the Department of the South. His name was Gilmore, and he is going to use the 54th Massachusetts as part of his plan to try to take Morris Island, which guarded the approach to the important city of Charleston, the symbol of secession. So Gilmore's plan was to try to take Morris Island, which you can see there at the entrance to Charleston Harbor, and he is going to send the 54th Massachusetts to do a landing and a diversion on James Island, which is where the bulk of the Confederate Army defending Charleston was posted. So the 54th Massachusetts will land on James Island in July of 1863. They will fight an action against Confederate defenders, and 13 soldiers from the 54th Massachusetts were captured. Just a few days later, more soldiers from the 54th Massachusetts would be captured. That is because Gilmore puts the 54th Massachusetts as the lead regiment in his attack on Fort Wagner, which was located on the tip of Morris Island. It was a fort that must be taken if the Union was going to capture Morris Island. So this is a map that shows the approach that the 54th Massachusetts had to make to Fort Wagner. You can see it's a very narrow approach between the sea and some swamps and marshes. So the men make this attack. The attack is repulsed, but more prisoners are captured. So now we have basically an international crisis, because the Confederacy had now captured men who were born free in northern states and who were part of a regiment that was commanded by white officers who had wealthy and influential families. So there is incredible publicity both in Europe and in northern states about what's going to happen to these prisoners from the 54th Massachusetts. So the Lincoln administration decides to issue an order to try to force the Confederacy's hand. It's called General Order Number 252. It was issued July 31st, 1863. This order says that to sell or enslave any captured person on account of his color and for no offense against the laws of war is a relapse into barbarism and a crime against the civilization of the age. And the order said that a Confederate prisoner of war would be put to hard labor for every U.S. soldier sold into slavery, and that the United States government would execute a Confederate prisoner of war for every U.S. soldier put to death. Now, according to the international laws of war, if you're going to implement a retaliation order, so this is a retaliation order, you have to have specific information before you can actually implement it. Well, the problem was the United States did not have any official information about what happened to the prisoners from the 54th who had been captured on James Island and Morris Island. They knew that prisoners were taken, but they didn't know where they were, they didn't know their names, they didn't know what had happened to them. But the United States government did have specific information about 3 New York sailors: Orrin H. Brown, William H. Johnson, and William Wilson. These were 3 black men who were born in New York. They enlisted in the United States Navy early in the Civil War, and they served on a ship that was shipwrecked and attacked by the Confederates off of the coast of South Carolina. These 3 men had been taken and put in the Charleston jail yard. But right before the action on Morris Island with the 54th Massachusetts, they managed to smuggle a letter out of their jail that was taken to the Caribbean and then managed to work its way up to the United States War Department. And in this letter, they identified themselves as U.S. sailors. They said that they had been captured, that they were not being treated as prisoners of war, that they were being held in a local jail, and they demanded help. And they said, for God's sakes, we are members of the United States Navy. Help us. So now the Lincoln administration had specific information about 3 black prisoners who were not being treated as legitimate combatants, even though they were born free and were Northern citizens. So what the Lincoln administration does is it takes those 3 names and the Lincoln administration communicates with the Confederate government and says, we are setting aside 3 white South Carolina soldiers. If you execute or harm in any way these 3 sailors, we will execute these 3 South Carolina soldiers. The Confederate War Department received this letter and they knew the Lincoln administration was serious. And more than that, the Confederate War Department was itself divided over its own policy because some people in the Confederate War Department knew that what the Confederate government was doing violated the international laws of war. So let's take Robert Garlick Hill Keene, who was the chief of the Confederate Bureau of War. He was a lawyer, a well-trained lawyer. And here is what he wrote about the situation. It is very clear the United States have the right to enlist any of their own citizens. They have long in those states regarded Negroes as citizens, as in Massachusetts, allowing them the right of suffrage. And Keene also pointed out that in the War of 1812, the United States had recruited and enlisted free black men from northern and southern states to fight in the War of 1812. So he says, we've got to be careful here because our international law might turn against us. So the Confederate government actually asked the governor of South Carolina not to try and not to execute any of the men from the 54th Massachusetts, who were actually being held in the Charleston jail yard. That is where they were. Well, the governor of the governor of South Carolina, he does want to try them. He wants to try all of the men from the 54th, and he wants to try the 3 sailors for violating South Carolina law against instigating servile insurrection. So despite what he'd been instructed to do by the Confederate government, he puts together a tribunal to try 3 men from the 54th Massachusetts who he believed were former slaves, not freeborn men. But something really interesting happens. The tribunal refuses to hear the case. The tribunal says, we don't have jurisdiction. So this tribunal in South Carolina is clearly worried about the ramifications of this situation, and so they won't touch it. Well, this means that the Confederate government, with the hostages, with the action of this court in Charleston, they decide that they are going to have to give in to the Lincoln administration's perspective, and they're going to have to start treating free black soldiers as legitimate prisoners of war. And we see that happen in the next major battle in the Department of the South that involves black soldiers. So in February 1864, the United States Army is going to land in Florida and march to Jacksonville to capture and occupy Jacksonville. And then troops will continue to move into the countryside, including the 54th Massachusetts and the 8th USCT. So USCT means U.S. Colored Troops. This was a regiment that was raised in Philadelphia, as well as the 1st North Carolina, which is a black regiment comprised of formerly enslaved people from North Carolina. So these troops are going to participate in the Battle of Olustee in February 1864. This battle is a disaster for the U.S. Army. Its commanders were incompetent. They did a terrible job. And so the U.S. is going to lose this battle. And there's going to be a lot of black soldiers who are left wounded on the field as the U.S. Army retreats. Now, there's going to be a massacre of many of these wounded soldiers by Confederate soldiers before Confederate officers stop them. But after that massacre is done, there are about 71 black United States soldiers who have been captured by the Confederate Army. And what's going to happen is the Confederate Army is going to take these men, put them on a train, and ship them to a brand new prison in Georgia, Andersonville Prison. There will be 71 black prisoners shipped to Andersonville. This actually recognizes these prisoners as legitimate prisoners of war because they will be sent to the same military prison where white soldiers are sent. Now, these 71 black prisoners at Andersonville will be treated differently than the white soldiers in the prison. They're going to be taken outside the prison gates to do kind of hard labor, and they will often be whipped to make them work. But their presence in the prison still indicates that they are considered legitimate combatants. And we actually then see that the Confederacy is going to have to publicly recognize that they've made this change, because one of the black soldiers of the 54th Massachusetts, who was still in the Charleston jail yard, manages to sneak out a letter. And his letter says, "The privations of the white soldiers are nothing in comparison to ours. In our destitute condition, being as it were without friends and in the enemy's hands, with an almost utter hopelessness of being released, and not having heard from our friends and families since we were captured." This letter is going to name who the men from the 54th Massachusetts are that are still being held in the Charleston jail yard. And that list is going to include the 3 black sailors that we talked about, but also somebody very famous in the North, the grandson of Sojourner Truth. Her grandson, James Caldwell, is one of the prisoners from the 54th Massachusetts in the Charleston jail yard. And here's a picture of Sojourner Truth holding a picture of her grandson in her lap. Well, now that these names have been released, international publicity again turns to the Confederacy and what it is doing. And the Confederate government has to back off. The Confederate Secretary of War, his name was James Seddon, and after this he is going to send instructions to southern state governors. In these instructions he says the congressional resolutions about black soldiers are defunct because of the embarrassments attending the problems of free black prisoners. He said that serious consequences might ensue from rigidly enforcing the act, and he ordered that free black soldiers would be treated as prisoners of war, and then he added this little caveat, except in some trivial particulars indicative of inferior consideration. So he wants to be sure that black soldiers are made to feel inferior, but they have to be treated as prisoners of war. So after this, the Confederate government is going to deliver to the United States a group of naval prisoners that had been held, and in that delivery, they deliver the 3 black sailors from New York. So this indicates for the first time to the United States government that the Confederacy will treat black men born free as legitimate combatants. The rest of the prisoners from the 54th Massachusetts who weren't in Andersonville prison will finally be transferred out of the Charleston jail yard and put in the Florence military prison in South Carolina with the other white soldiers. Now, this is not a good thing to happen in a way because of the terrible conditions in Florence military prison, but it officially recognized these men as legitimate combatants. And then just a couple of months later, the Confederacy will officially change their laws. On February 8, 1865, they amend their original resolution. So the original law used the phrase, quote, employ Negro slaves. The new amendment says, it will say employ Negro slaves is how it changes, instead of saying employ Negroes in war against the Confederate States. And then they repealed the sections that required military courts to execute or punish white officers. And they repealed the section that required Confederate officers to deliver black prisoners to state authorities. So they officially put in their law that they would no longer just consider any black person in U.S. uniform to be committing servile insurrection, and that they would recognize free black men as legitimate combatants. After they did that, the Confederate States of America began to deliver black prisoners back to the United States Army, including all of the prisoners from the 54th Massachusetts who hadn't died of disease in those prisons. They were all released, and they were all returned back to Union lines, where they were reunited with their regiment and they were reunited with their families. This moment happened because of the perseverance, the determination of 3 black sailors who were determined to get their message to the world, and they were determined to change Confederate policy, and they did.